One, just so you know, this meeting is being recorded so that we can post it on the Brown School website for all to enjoy even after the event is concluded. And welcome to a brand new offering from the Brown School. We're calling it Open Classroom. My name is Gary Parker. I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs and Director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute at the Brown Washington University in St. Louis, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy. These are challenging times for our nation and our world, and at the same time, admired how many individuals, organizations, and companies have done so to extend themselves. And the Brown School wants to do our part. So with so many people under stay-at-home orders, we wanted to offer the opportunity to open our virtual doors and share with you some opportunities of professional development and even perhaps learning about something new. So every Tuesday and Thursday at 12:30 for the next 5 weeks, we'll be featuring some of the Brown School's world-renowned social work, public health, and social policy faculty. And I want to thank Janet Gillow and the professional development team for pulling together this series so quickly. I want to share with you too that next Tuesday, April 7th, from 12:30 to 1:30, we'll be featuring Professor Barry Rosenberg, who will give a talk on mastering major gift solicitation. Previously, Professor Rosenberg completed a 37-year career in nonprofit leadership, and which culminated as the CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis, the Jewish community's central fundraising, planning, and community building organizations. Given the current challenges facing nonprofits, particularly in fundraising, this will be an incredibly informative and engaging talk, and I would encourage all of you to join us back here for that one. And today, we will be hearing from Dean Mary McKay. In addition, Dean of the Brown School, she's a federally funded researcher who spent her career developing evidence-based family strengthening interventions that have been translated for cultural context around the world, including Uganda and Argentina and the Philippines. And her talk is titled, "I Went for an Intake and Never Went Back." And it will explore how mental health providers can best engage with families so that they are more likely to participate in mental health services. One note, since we have over 300 registered participants today, we have muted your microphones. In fact, registration has been so high for the series that we've had to upgrade our Zoom license so we can accommodate everyone who's interested. I want to encourage you to register for the other upcoming courses. If registration has reached maximum capacity, like today, we'll be broadcasting the event via YouTube, and subsequently all of the talks will be posted on our website. If you have any questions, type them into the general chat box. Janet and I will be monitoring them and sharing them with Dean McKay during the Q&A. So without any further ado, please welcome Dean Mary McKay.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Janet, and thank you everyone that has chosen to spend lunchtime with us at the Brown School, and me in particular. Gary, thanks for that introduction. I just thought I would say another couple of words about where the work comes from that I'm going to share, who are the real knowledge producers of this work. And so humbly, I come from practice. I spent years, decades in direct practice settings around kids' mental health, kids' health, child welfare. And even as I moved into my role as an academic, all of my scholarship really was in partnership with families, community members, providers, really trying to come up with new solutions to some of the challenges that we experienced in practice. And so the title of my particular kind of open classroom lecture today is pretty provocative. I went for an intake and never went back. And that title didn't come from me. It came from a set of family collaborators that I'm going to introduce you to next that really were my partners, our partners in creating new trainings and supports for direct practitioners like myself around how we could more effectively engage kids and families in the services that we were trying to provide. And so what I'm going to try to do in like 30 minutes or less is give you the crash course of everything we know from the evidence base about things that you can do simply in your practice today, tomorrow, and the next day to try to improve engagement. Why do I think this is important? Is because many of us in the practice community are trying to engage our existing kids and families over the telephone, over these things that we call Zoom. And so in some ways, even if you had an existing relationship with a child or family before all of this upheaval, in some ways you're re-engaging them. And then in others, you are opening up capacity to meet the new needs that kids and families are experiencing, whether that be their mental health needs, their health needs, their financial needs. And yet engagement over these alternate means is pretty challenging. And so my hope is that even if you're very experienced at this, I'll have something that can help you work more effectively in this new day, because after all, we all really need supports in this new world that we are in. So this next slide presents an amazing looking group of young people, of parents and grandparents, of providers, health providers, mental health providers, child welfare workers. And this is actually the group that put together the set of information and then led the studies that I'm actually gonna talk with you about today. So I want you to kind of think about, this doesn't just come from the professor that's telling you what to do, but it's actually grounded in the experience of families and providers in your shoes, that hopefully this will speak to you as very practical. And things that you can easily implement and adapt and take away in your particular setting. So as we go on this quick electronic journey together, I want you just to take a moment and consider some of the obstacles that you previously or currently are encountering as you try to get kids and families involved in a whole range of services. And how might you apply some of the principles that I'm going to talk with you about to some of those obstacles? Not all of them are going to apply. Some need different kind of interventions, but at least I'm going to take you through some ways that you can use yourself, particularly in these funky new mediums, over the telephone. In those of you that are kind of my age contemporaries have heard me refer to these Zoom calls as like the Hollywood Squares. Hollywood Squares was a game show many decades ago, but this is not the most engaging format for humans to relate to each other, right? But many of you are having to use these mediums to engage your clients. And so to think about, is there anything here in this new world that we might be more effective in terms of engagement? So let me just give you the background. When I asked you to consider obstacles, if you had a few obstacles, you're not alone. In the world of kids' mental health, for example, there are by far more kids that actually need contact with us than actually do receive those services. And I'm particularly worried, as I know many of you on this particular call are, that those kids and families that actually have some of the fewest resources, those that their families are affected by poverty or racism, that they actually encounter way more barriers to service use. So I'm particularly worried in this kind of pandemic era about how we pay attention to the kids made most vulnerable by poverty and racism, and how we try to extend ourselves and be the best engagers possible. Those of you that are in practice know that failures of engagement, we've made up a whole lingo. We call those families no-shows or dropouts, but those are really kind of the language that we use to try to kind of give voice to our experience about how much a challenge it can be to actually fully engage kids and families in the services that we offer. I share those perspectives as a practitioner, but also those are really failures for kids and families as well. And so how to help kids and families engage with us and overcome those challenges and obstacles, that's the whole point of everything else that I'm going to talk with you about today. So those of you that are reaching for new solutions, we need new ideas, we need feedback, but I also want you to hopefully see this crisis as an opportunity for things where you can try new things, you can collaborate in different ways, and in our world, new ideas come from young people and parents and providers and community members. And so as you're in the day-to-day world of trying to provide essential services to kids and families, trying to meet their needs for healthcare, emotional supports, mental health care, that we actually also use some of that time to get new ideas of what would be acceptable to our consumers and relevant so that we can create new effective solutions as well. So I'm going to talk with you particularly around how you can use the telephone, how you can use Zoom and other electronic means to actually really help target those no-show rates and more fully engage kids and families. And so for many of us, we didn't do our work in these alternative formats. And so how can you translate what you already know, but also how can you stick as close as you can to the evidence base to help you be successful? And that's the whole rest of my talk. So for years, we collaborated with young people and families and communities to try to think about how we could particularly do a better job engaging them, and what were some things that we could say or do, particularly in initial meetings or when we were resetting a relationship, that would be really helpful. And so for the experienced practitioners, I'm going to go through these 4 points and you're going to say, oh, I know all that. But I'm going to talk us through why some of these empirical evidence elements really may matter in terms of really cementing kids and families to the services and care opportunities that you wish. So the first thing that you can do, whether it be the start of an initial contact or resetting an ongoing relationship with kids and families, is really clarify what's the work that you're trying to do together. And that seems pretty straightforward in practice, right? We're always trying to kind of clarify what's the need that we're trying to make, what goals are we trying to work for. But I have to say that what I've learned from my collaborators and why they titled this talk, I Went for an Intake and Never Came Back, was because parents have a particular perspective on whose need we're really meeting. And they often are silent when we talk about goals, and they may have some questions or concerns about those goals. And how they express their perspective is they don't come back. So one of the first guidance that our parent collaborators gave us is to really lead with what is the articulated need of that family member, of that child, and that those in parents' own words get stated over and over again, as opposed to what often happens in practice is we kind of take our information from referral sources, the referring agent, and although there's a lot of value in those collaborators giving us information about a child and family, what helps a child and family cement to our services is that they feel like their needs are front and center. Many times our parents guided us to ask a key question that I hardly ever asked, typically as a practitioner, which is when they've been referred for services, does the family agree with that referral? And when I started to ask that question systematically, where were the places that they agreed and where were the places that they disagreed? that opened up a whole new set of avenues for me to engage them. The other piece that is part of our evidence-based engagement tools have to do with actually acknowledging the situations of young people and their families and recognizing the good job, the effort that they're putting forth in really stressful circumstances. And in some ways, as I trained with parent collaborators at my side, we used to practice all the ways that we would signal to caregivers and the young people that we saw their strengths, we saw their effort, we saw how much they were putting in, and we started to really systematically be sure that multiple times we were actually calling out the strengths so that this was an experience that families really thought about as distinct from some of the other experiences they might have had where they felt judged or misunderstood. Last 2 points around our telephone engagement interventions. We did incorporate some time where we asked questions around how families felt about either initial or ongoing attempts to seek help. And when families would tell us, oh no, they felt fine about this, we often said, well, that's terrific. But families had asked some questions previously, or they had some concerns previously. And we started to run through that list, and it opened up doors for what families described as they had a lot of questions. Even if they were your ongoing client, they still had a lot of questions about how this process was going to help, what this transition meant to them in this kind of crisis situation. And so to open up the space. And then we spent a lot of time problem solving around both concrete obstacles as well as other obstacles in the relationship. Now, when you look at that, especially experienced practitioners say, oh, I do all those things all the time. But in fact, what we found is, even with experienced practitioners, if we spend time in every session really helping a family, helping a child articulate what need were we going to meet this time, having them hear us recognize their strengths and their effort, giving them space to talk about concerns they might have, either related to previous experiences or questions they might have that they haven't asked, and then problem solving. What we found is when we started to do that systematically, we started actually to see a significant reduction in the no-shows that we had and the ruptures in engagement. And I'll just give you just a little bit of idea about what those results look like. In child mental health, for example, about 50% of all child mental health appointments are kept by families, and the other 50%, not so much. They're those things that we call no-shows. And so in our work, as we started to systematically put those 4 principles into action in our sessions, you'll see the bars on the left. Disproportionately, families started to engage in initial intakes, in assessment appointments, and then I'll show you a little bit that they returned. Same thing, and we did this over and over again with hundreds of families across different types of settings. What the blue bar suggests is when you start to experiment and really concentrate on your engagement skills and how you apply those, it makes a difference for families returning and that hopefully ultimately having a good experience. So I've run through that really quickly, but what we try to do and what we continue to do is, even in brief contacts with kids and their families, that each of those contacts begin with the child and family's need. They hear from us a real positive utterance about how much we see them putting forth effort, how stressful things are, how much we respect them. We always try to open up space for questions and most specifically concerns, and then really engage in any kind of problem solving around obstacles that we can kind of think through with the family. So I hope that that was clear. It's very funky to be lecturing over this particular format because I don't always see people in their head nods, but I can hardly wait to get to the chat so you could ask me particular questions. So I'm assuming, Gary, who I can see, my voice is coming through loud and clear?
Yes, and I just recently checked with the chat room to see if everyone can see and hear fine, and we're getting all positive reports.
Wonderful. So I wish I could see everybody's thumbs up, but I'm glad. That's really helpful to me. So I've given you kind of 4 things to pay attention to over the telephone, in some of your kind of internet sessions, some of your face-to-face sessions. I want to also talk about some additional research that was, again, very driven by families to kind of help us to how do you get through assessment and beyond in terms of engaging kids and families. So the first is to kind of go back to basics, to really kind of ground every interaction we have, which is how are we meeting those needs that young people and their families have identified, and how are we constantly attending to an engagement process, given what I put out is kind of typical, which is, there's a lot of ruptures in engagement. There's a lot of disengagement in the services that we provide in addition to engagement. And so these next 4, and I put out 4 because busy practitioners really can't remember more than that. And we share these pretty transparently also with families as well. What are some additional things that you want at top of mind as you're working with your family during some of these crisis times? The first is, again, to connect what you are doing to the felt needs of families. And it might be incredibly obvious to us, particularly experienced providers, about why we're talking about particular topics, why we're exploring particular areas. But what families told us in study after study is sometimes they were confused about the questions that they were asking, or why we were paying attention to particular aspects of family life, or talking to their children about particular things. And so they needed us to connect the dots better. And so to really be thoughtful about not going too fast, making sure that the parents, that the young people were connecting those dots in the same way. And we found that when we train providers in really just taking a moment to go in slower than they might have ordinarily, I'll show you the data. You won't be surprised that led to families sticking with the services a little bit longer. We also know that you're incredibly busy and you have a way of working. And many of us, perhaps even at the Brown School, were taught about kind of laying the foundation for engaging relationships and kind of setting up expectations. What was the family going to be responsible for? What was myself as a social worker going to be responsible for? And in fact, we got a lot of feedback from families that they wanted to hear from us that yes, they were going to be responsible for things, but they were most interested in the collaboration. They were feeling pretty stressed about some of the concerns that they had about their kids. And so they were much more interested in, when we use the word we, what we were going to do together, because they had felt like the reason they were reaching out is because they were doing some of their best work that they could with their kids, but they needed extra help. They needed to be in it with a partnership with us. And so that kind of paying attention to how am I setting a collaborative table, what we're going to work on together, became really important, and also a source of relief for caregivers that they didn't have to have all the answers, because there was a lot of concern and sometimes shame with having a child that was struggling. And so that use of we was really important. And then focus on the practicality. I'm going to, in just a few minutes, if any of you are working with kids that have behavioral challenges, I'm going to give you some things, very practical tips that you can work on quickly with your families and share with them. Having a child with behavioral difficulties and now being at home with them all day, incredibly challenging. And so what families are often looking for us, particularly in times of crisis like now, are things that they can try immediately, that are practical, that are understandable, that are tied to to kind of their stresses and strains at home. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a minute. And then finally, in every encounter with families, we try to not take it for granted that families would want to have an additional contact, but to problem solve some of the other barriers that they were experiencing. And in every situation, as we ended a contact with families, how was this contact for them? Did they appreciate it? Did they have any questions or concerns? Were they interested in continuing? And so it was those 8 tips, the 4 that I just gave you, as well as tying everything that we're doing back to families' need, really emphasizing the collaboration, really thinking about practical relief for kids and families, as well as problem solving. Those are kind of the 8 principles that over and over again, as practitioners started to systematically put those into some of the work that they did with families, you saw graphs that look like this, that instead of dropping out that green bar, and I know some of you, I hear that there's alums that haven't been in school in a little while, but you can still read data from the Brown School. What this graph suggests that if you kind of engaged in kind of business as usual practice, even really good practice, the trend lines followed what the national averages were, which is families dropped out. And by the 3rd session, really had only about 40% of your families still with you, in this case, in children's mental health. The top line, the red line, when you really focused every single time on engagement, more families actually stuck with you in the care that they wanted. And so hopefully, if you're in kids' mental health, some of this translates directly. If you're in other types of services, some of this might translate into what you're doing on the phone in brief encounters with families. It might in healthcare services, in financial services, but really what this says is engagement has to be top of mind. Practicality, collaboration, connecting the dots for families, incredibly important. And I'll end with just a little bit about practicality. Part of our work is how do you engage kids and families in the services that they needed. But really, in our work in mental health, we were most concerned about young people that had emerging conduct or disruptive behavioral challenges. Those were the kids that were getting in trouble at home and at school. And what we knew about those kids is that if you were getting in trouble and you were little, it was exactly what your grandmother said. Little kids, little challenges, little problems. Bigger kids, bigger challenges or problems. So what we wanted to do is be very focused on young people and try to help them be behaviorally successful. And the key is really working with families and working with schools, but right now our schools are out. And so families are bearing the bulk of the day with kids, trying to help those kids be successful. And so there's a lot that we know about what families can do, but also things that affect their parenting. And so I'm not going to go through all of this literature with you, but what this kind of list of things says is parenting, communication, the support of relationships that you create within your families really matter. But if you're a parent that experiences a lot of stress, if you don't have enough resources, whether emotional support or financial resources, if you haven't been able to access the care and the services that you need, in some ways, you're really struggling as a parent, and those things can take you out of the game in terms of helping your child. So if you are working with families and though they have kids that are really struggling, there's a set of very practical work that you can do with those kids that is highly engaging, that will also be a relief to some of your families. And so I just give you these words, 4 words that begin with the word R, 2 words that begin with the word S. These are a set of domains that are directly linked to how kids behave. Either they're successful or they struggle. And so let me just take you through a few of these. Stress for kids, stress for families, we as practitioners know is really toxic. And so if you're worried about helping a family help their child be more behaviorally successful, anything that you can do practically to help a caregiver think through how do you lower the stress in these very stressful times, that will help. In addition to, in this time of social distance, how is it that you can help a caregiver really think about connecting in any way they can think of to more positive supports? Those will help to create the conditions that take the stress off a caregiver, that make them really more available to parenting kids in these very stressful times. There's a lot of materials that go along with these parts of family life that are key to success. Respectful communication, that's an R, raised by grandmothers. Communication is great for grandmothers, but it's got to be respectful. It's also tied to the literature that suggests that in these times of being together in your home, creating the space to talk and listen to each other is really important. It's really hard to do that, though, if you're under enormous stress, if you don't have enough social support. And so the idea being not just to ask parents and kids to talk to each other, but also to lower the temperature, to increase the support so that communication is possible. Same thing for some new sets of rules or structures within families. We're hearing from a lot of families that having the kids home every day is incredibly taxing. And so how is it that you create a new way of being together? And this varies by development and age of your child, by personality, but some kind of structure will help also lower the stress. And I'm happy, Janet and Gary, there's a lot of practical tools and materials that that practitioners should just pick up and send to families or work with them. I'm happy to share those in whatever way you think that's possible. I will show you that when you work with kids and families in this way, families are highly engaged. These are just some attendance data from these things that we call multiple family groups, where we work with kids and their children who are having behavioral challenges. Those of you, even if you've been out of school for a long time, you know these are percentages of those families that are actually attending groups. And we're really proud that about 80% of families come and pick up their completion certificate at the end of working on those 4 R's and 2 S's. The red line are the dropout of services as usual for those kids and families. So what we want to do is kind of challenge all of us to kind of think hard about what's the opportunity as we're trying to do our work of more fully engaging kids and families. How do I use this empirical base, this science base, to actually plan out some new practices, try out some new things in my practice, whether that be on the phone or over Zoom or in the email that I'm sending to families? How do I try those out? How do I check in with families? And how do I make decisions about what will really help our families in this new day? And so with that, I'm a little bit over 30 minutes, but I'm happy to engage in conversation, as somewhat limited as this is. And I hope I've given you some things to think about, but mostly what I hoped I've done is for the practitioners that are day-to-day working with kids and families, I've put engagement now on the top of your mind. What am I doing to systematically engage kids and families more fully, particularly in this crisis, when I'm impacted as a practitioner, where they're impacted as a practitioner, as a child or family? How do I really try to use this as an opportunity to take a look at my practice, to try out some new things, and see if I can get even better and better outcomes for kids and families? So with that, I'll stop. And Gary, I don't know if I put everybody to sleep. You can probably see better than I. And I'm happy to take any questions related to the content here, but I also recognize that not all of our community has access to the Dean of the Brown School. all the time. And so this could be the moment that you could elevate other community needs that we as an institution or a school might be able to meet, because we're really, I think, sensitive. This particular open classroom concept really started out as a request from one of our organizations to say, I've got all kinds of my colleagues working remotely. Can the Brown School help us to use this as an opportunity? And I'm incredibly grateful, Janet and Gary and professional development, for meeting that call in addition to all of us. So thank you. Thank you so much for the time and for listening.
Thank you, Dean McKay. That was incredibly informative. And when we were putting together this series, and you and I have worked together for a long time, I said, you have to do your talk. I went for an intake and never went back. I've seen you give this a number of times, in a number of occasions, in a number of countries, and it's always been positively received. We're getting a lot of comments, a lot of people writing head nodding. Since you can't see, they were typing it in there. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
And we also have a lot of positive comments coming in, appreciating the information. And we had a couple of questions too. One was, do these same strategies work for court-mandated family engagement?
As a matter of fact, I have a colleague, her name is Geetha Gopalan. She found they actually work better with court-mandated clients. Why is that? Because whether you're court-mandated as a family to come for services, or whether you're what we call a voluntary client, my experience in kids' mental health is nobody's really voluntary. They've been encouraged, they've been forced, they've been directed to get some help. But what is unique about some of the features that I've put out is we know that whether you're court mandated, whether you're called a voluntary client, this is always a choice about whether you're going to engage. And for families to really think through what need could this meet for them, whatever category you are as a family, if you can't figure out how this meets a need, you are much less likely to come. And so to give all families, depending, no matter how they got to you, the opportunity to sort through what their most pressing felt needs are and connecting the dots to what you do, I think that will differentiate you from many, many other experiences that particularly, who we call mandated clients have with helpers. And so to really kind of put front and center, what are those needs? Including for some of our work in mental health, to disentangle themselves from the systems that families find themselves in, incredibly important. And I'm happy to share some of this other literature, but my colleague Geetha Gopalan actually found that when applied systematically to families that were in the child welfare services, they actually were more appreciative of the real honest discussion around what their questions were, what their concerns were, and found that connecting the dots actually helped them engage more than they might ordinarily. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So then, just as a follow-up to that, so the skill would be something to say like, we know that you are mandated, but it's still a choice to participate, and we thank you. Is that the...
I think that's one way to say it, Gary. That's not bad for, Gary didn't come from a practice background, and that's actually not bad.
I can't take credit for that. It was one of our participants, Mary.
Exactly. But that's one way, that's exactly right. That's one way to say it, to acknowledge that even in the situation where you've been required by an entity we know that actually you as an adult, you as the head of your household will make choices about whether you're going to follow up and how you're going to make use of this opportunity. And so you want to hear adult to adult, what needs could be helpful to meet. And if there's a struggle identifying that makes sense, because in a situation where you've been directed, we may have to take some extra time in really figuring that out. Yeah.
And Janet, I know you caught a question from earlier. I wanted to make sure we didn't miss that one before we continue down the chat room.
Sure. So there have been several people asking for anything more you can share by way of sort of what's concrete and practical, how you can address the issues that we know can get in the way of people coming back, like childcare, transportation, and just time management.
So let me address the difference between concrete obstacles and perceptual obstacles for just a minute. So what do I mean by concrete obstacles? There are things that Janet, you just named: time, transportation, childcare, and as a practitioner, I spent an enormous amount of time kind of problem solving around those concrete obstacles. And I do not want to diminish how they operate in families' lives. There are really significant challenges, barriers, obstacles. I do, though, want to share a number of important studies with families as our collaborators that either we have done or members of those in our groups have done, that have suggested that those are the obstacles that families talk with us about. So my childcare fell apart, I don't have a way to get to. That is no question, that is the lived experience of a practitioner. But in the research studies we've done, when we would put those obstacles to predict whether families would come against what I call perceptual obstacles, which is I have really serious concerns about mental health. Does this make my child crazy? Is this going to give my child a label? Are they going to use medication on my child as the only answer? Is this, we put a lot of stigma on people that use services. When you didn't address all of those really serious questions and concerns that families had out loud, they often called and said, my ride canceled, right? Perceptual obstacles really play a driving role in how families choose or not choose to use services. And there's usually a lot of them, and they usually get unspoken. And so what families told us in multiple studies, as well as in focus groups, they said, look, I can often figure out my concrete obstacles if it's really important for me to get somewhere, and I really think I'm going to get the help that I need. But unless you address those things that really worry families, they are much less likely to come. And it's hard to open up space for those things because it doesn't feel good to talk about, I'm a mental health provider. I don't want families to feel crazy about coming to me. But many families have the goal of, I want to see the social worker quickly, and then I want them out of my life. And they don't state that. But that actually, so how you as a practitioner, especially if you're having trouble engaging families, not stick to only the concrete discussions, but also dig a little deeper. Say, many families have serious questions about whether they should sign up for these services at all. They're worried about who gets to see the information, how you use the information. Why is it that you're asking about who lives in my household or for private Social Security information? And so to kind of talk through some of the unasked questions to see if they apply, that has often been pretty key to actually getting to the root of what really are some of the engagement problems. So I don't want to minimize concrete obstacles, but I, for too long until I did this kind of set of research, would stop there. And as much problem solving as I did, it didn't seem to have the impact until we started to deal with those perceptual and difficult to talk about obstacles as well. Thanks for giving me that opportunity.
Yeah, we have a really great question from Steph who asks, in your experience, have you seen a difference in rates of engagement in families with younger kids versus teens versus older kids?
Yeah. What's really important for our child-centered people out there, myself included, is we often want to put kids and their adult caregivers on the same plane. Right? We want to take kids' concerns really seriously and adult caregiver concerns really seriously. For little kids, be really clear. The only way you have a client is that adult caregiver makes the decision to actually bring that child to you. And many times, caregivers feel like they're in competition. They want to frame the challenge, and we're listening to their kids, and they don't feel as listened. Be very clear. We've done several studies that suggest unless the caregiver feels like their needs are understood, they won't bring that child back. And that seems terrible to us that are much more child-centered, but for little kids, and that really matters, that caregiver really being able to feel heard and set the agenda. And it isn't that I'm saying that don't listen to kids, because of course I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is pay attention to who's actually going to give permission or will facilitate the child being involved, right? Because that engagement of that caregiver is everything for younger kids. Younger kids by far and their families are easier to engage in services. And it has everything to do with kind of caregivers. So they proportionally come more often. However, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted, could you give some ages when you're referring to these younger kids and little kids that's coming up?
Yeah. So primarily elementary school kids. You know, it's very rare to have really little kids, although we have some great early intervention service providers. I could actually do a whole other talk here if you want me to talk about early intervention and little kids 0 to 3 and 0 to 5 and engaging their families. But in kind of mental health services, it's often elementary school kids that are identified by school and referred. Adolescents are the least likely to actually take advantage of mental health services. So those of you that work in integrative settings where you're working on healthcare services or reproductive health and behavioral health, those are actually prime places to engage adolescents. If you are engaging adolescents, what is important to pay attention to is they do have some additional autonomy if they have parents' permission to come see you. But we often do have adult caregivers or families be on the sidelines in those kind of relationships. The science really suggests that you do have to find at least one adult that really cares about that child and is on that journey and involve them in their care as well. And so it's sometimes extra work, but to really pay attention to family engagement, even when you're working with adolescents, but it can be more challenging. Our systems are better set up to handle younger kids, elementary school age kids and their families. As kids get older, there's often more disagreement from a child about attending. Parents are often feeling more beleaguered if children have had behavior problems for a while. They've many times tried earlier when the child was younger and it wasn't that helpful. And so there's more hurdles to give families the kind of support and optimism they need to try again. I should actually say one thing about the families that are likely to come into some of the services that I see online here. Many of your families, they will be approaching you for the first time, but you won't be their first attempt to get help. About half the parents in all of our longitudinal studies of kids in care, their parents tried to get help earlier, and a lot of them didn't feel like they got their needs met. Now, that could have been a provider issue, a family issue, a context issue. Can't really even know what that previous issue is, but if your family's had a bad experience previously, history will repeat itself unless you really take the time to take apart what didn't work well the last time. And so be careful to ask about those prior negative experiences, because if families have had them, they're often in their future as well, unless you really kind of set the table in a different way. I hope that helps.
It does. And Dean McKay, we're getting a lot of requests to take you up on that offer for engagement 0 to 5, and we will most likely be extending this open classroom series. So I hope that we can call on you to focus specifically on that age population.
And let me also just say a word about the practical tools. There are a set of websites that you can download, for example, activities that you can do with your families to relieve stress, activities that you can do with your families to identify the important support people. And you'll have to adapt these because those materials, you know, they weren't created for a pandemic where you couldn't be with people, but you probably could use some of those materials. There's stress checklists, there's relaxation, there's a lot of fun family games that kids and their families can play to open up communication. So if we can figure out how to get to the participants on the webinar some additional resources for more training in this area that are free, and places to download these materials. I'm happy to disseminate some of those so that we can get real practical and you could get your hands on these tools.
That would be great, Mary. We've already had a request for the PDF of your presentation to be emailed to everyone. So we're planning to do that, but any additional resources or toolkit, we can certainly distribute to this group, as well as adding to our website so that future folks can find that.
Yeah, these are free, and the other thing that there's been multiple occasions where I've actually trained in those 4 R's and 2 S's. Those are all on the web, and I can send you those links. So if you're really interested in kids with behavioral challenges, you can get some additional training in this way.
Here's another really interesting question. Many of the families want their child, quote unquote, fixed. And when that doesn't happen after 1 or 2 sessions, they don't come back. How do you overcome that obstacle?
So I'm going to help you reframe a little bit how I understand about wanting a child fixed. I'm going to describe that caregiver is at their wit's end. If you are a parent, regardless of your circumstances and your challenges, you care about your child, you love the child. Our research suggests that you reach out to mental health systems or other helping systems almost as a last resort. And so by the time you are taking this loved individual, your child who you have done the world for, and you haven't been successful, and you said to somebody you don't know, like Gary Parker, could you fix this kid? It's really an extreme cry for help. And when you say back to them something version of what I used to say, which is, well, it took a long time to get here. It's going to take a long time to address these situations. It's the most discouraging message ever, because I'm at my wit's end. You seem to have a professional degree. Do something. And so how I respond to that is how much distress you must feel that you've tried a whole bunch of things and you're still so worried about your kid. And so I will take your sense of urgency as seriously as I possibly can. And that's where some of these practical tools come in, because you're right, practitioners, some of these situations are really complicated and they take some real time to improve, but families also have to experience some relief for them to keep going. And so that's often why we work on stress and social support first, because I fix my kid. The Brown School is fantastic, but nowhere in graduation do we issue you a magic wand where in 2 or 3 contexts with families, you are going to be able to improve complex situations. I wish I had that, but you got a diploma and a set of skills to really work with families. So to say to families, I hear your distress, and we're going to try to lower that temperature on the distress. And many times it comes from the child, but a lot of times that stress also comes from a number of other pressures on families. And for you to kind of figure out, is there any relief, any clue that you can give families early on in this experience that they should stick with this because this will be helpful? And maybe some of those stress and social support resources, we often give those to families early on, way earlier than we actually get into treatment relationships. Why? Because we're trying to take the pressure off so that they can feel like it's worth investing. So I appreciate actually that's a practitioner who's really working day to day with families in high levels of distress.
Yeah, some comments like, it sure would be nice to have a magic wand, and particularly for these times.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of folks just reinforcing that they would love the additional resources. So what we'll do when we post this open classroom on the Brown School website, we'll also post alongside it the PowerPoint presentation and other resources that would be helpful in improving family engagement.
Could I say one other, just a couple of other things, because I know that people are working so hard and, but also maybe have some capacity remotely. You know, we work with kids and families where the trauma exposure is almost universal. And so if you're thinking about engagement, make sure that those of you that kind of can really kind of take some of the frameworks of a trauma-informed lens. If you're working with families that have high levels of trauma, kids that have high levels of trauma, that the reactivity, the volatility, the kind of sensitivity to slights, irritability, all of those things make engagement even harder. And so to kind of really think about what's the calming, safe space that you're trying to create, where's the kind of degrees of freedom and avenues you're trying to open up to normalize feelings of stress, irritability, misunderstanding that occur especially as you're kind of either engaging initially or resetting a relationship that often has to do with trauma, and to connect some of that for families about how they're feeling relates to not only the current day, but also what's happened to them. And there's a lot of really good resources related to trauma-informed kind of engagement approaches that make this work, you know, important and complex. And I can try to get some of those resources together too, because those are available online.
And I just wanted to share too that the website this will be posted on is the Brown School's public site, so anyone will be able to access it. It's brownschool.wustl.edu. You'll also find right there on our homepage a lot of resources that are focused on COVID-19. I know a lot of that's top of mind for many of you who are here today, and so we are continually updating those resources. And I see Janet is also posting links in the chat box for some of these additional resources as well. So Dean McKay, we have like 2 minutes left. Do you want to give some closing comments? And then I'll just remind everyone about the next open classroom.
I do. I want to say to people online and those of you that are working with kids and families that I never have felt more proud to be part of these professions that we are. So many of you are on the front lines trying to practice in ways that we could not even imagine as professionals. Many of you are trying to carry out kind of your responsibilities as social workers, as public health practitioners, and also have your kids out of school and be practicing in your home when all of your structures and routines are changing. And so I just want to encourage this group to also do what we're advising kids and families that we're working with around taking care of yourself, grounding yourself. If you're feeling out of sorts, that's really real. I have never done a lecture kind of holed up in the corner of my home before like this. And so we're all being impacted. And so to be sure that I see and I understand, you know, what heroes that we have on the line and how much I really, really appreciate you being connected back to the Brown School. If you have students in your agency, be kind to them. This has been really a challenge for them to quickly go online with their instructors, finish their field hours. And I so appreciate their commitment and your commitment to our current students so that we can get them to graduate and join the ranks of people that are really going to make a difference, because kids, families, the most vulnerable, those kids and families made vulnerable by poverty, structural racism, those kids and families are going to be even more so. And we're going to need really strong practitioners that know best evidence and have the most compassion. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much, Dean McKay, for sharing your time and this incredible information. Thank you, Janet, for working behind the scenes to get this all going. And thanks to all of you who have stayed here from beginning to end and shared so many positive, kind words about today's open classroom. And I really hope that we can continue to see you. The next one, as I mentioned, is on Tuesday with Professor Barry Rosenberg. It will be incredibly informative. And thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.